Welcome back to the deep dive. It's really great to have you with us again. Today we're pointing our lens at a narrative that has practically become modern folklore at this point.
Oh, absolutely. It's huge.
Right. We're looking at a man whose name is entirely synonymous with just financial excess, rampant greed, and a level of unchecked hubris that most people simply cannot fathom. We are, of course, talking about the real-life figure behind one of the most chaotic Hollywood blockbusters of the 21st century.
The cultural footprint of this story is just massive, and navigating it is a pretty complex undertaking because we're dealing with a subject who has been so heavily mythologized, and not just by pop culture and cinema, but deliberately by the man himself.
Yeah, he's the architect of his own myth.
Exactly. So separating the cold reality from the cinematic spectacle requires a really careful, deliberate untangling of the narratives we've been fed.
Which is exactly why we've gathered an absolute mountain of source material for you today. I mean, to really get to the bottom of this, we couldn't just rely on one perspective.
No, you really can't with this guy.
Right, so we're pulling from entertainment and film analyses, looking at pieces from Acting Magazine, Cinema Blend, Watch Mojo, and History versus Hollywood. But we're also digging really deep into the heavy legal and historical documentation.
The paperwork is wild on this one.
Oh, it's dense. We've got files from Prismpedia, a highly detailed academic breakdown from the Wayne Law Review, and insights from the anti-money laundering platform SmartSearch.
And we also felt it was vital to include international perspectives, considering the global ripple effects of American financial fraud. So we're incorporating analysis from a Thai investment and finance blog called Long Tunmin. Furthermore, to understand the collateral human damage, which gets overlooked a lot, we're bringing in biographical details on his ex-wife, Nadine Karidi, from All That's Interesting.
We even found a fascinating Reddit thread that completely deconstructs the psychology of the final scene of the Martin Scorsese film.
Oh.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today goes far beyond just playing fact-checker for a movie.
That would be too easy.
Right. We want to decode a very specific mindset. We're focusing on his unique perspective, how his way of thinking radically differed from typical professionals in the finance field, and the underlying psychology of his extreme, almost pathological need for more.
That is the exact analytical pivot we need to make here. Because the actions themselves, the fraud, the parties, the eventual arrest, those are matters of public record. Anyone can look those up.
Exactly.
What we were really investigating is the architecture of his thought process. How did he rationalize his behavior to himself? How did he view the people on the other end of the telephone? And perhaps most uncomfortably for all of us, what does his sustained success, even today, long after his convictions, say about society's enduring susceptibility to a masterful sales pitch?
Let's start by looking at the foundation. Because if we want to understand the origin of a hustler, we have to look at the environment that shaped his baseline desires. I always find it fascinating when people assume that the architects of Wall Street corruption must have been, born into generational wealth.
Oh, the boarding school stereotype.
Yeah, attending elite prep schools and inheriting country club memberships. But that wasn't the case here at all. He grew up in a very standard middle-class family in the Queens and Bronx areas of New York.
Right. His parents were both accountants. They were hardworking, diligent professionals. But according to the analysis in that Long Tunman article, this middle-class stability actually served as a negative inspiration for him.
A negative inspiration. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, because he observed his parents and realized they lacked the two specific things he decided he wanted above all else: abundant, unlimited wealth and the free time to enjoy it. The traditional path of exchanging hours for a steady, predictable paycheck was entirely unappealing to him.
I want to drill down into how early his unique approach to business started manifesting. We hear stories about kids having paper routes or mowing lawns, which is essentially just trading manual labor for a few dollars. But his childhood hustle, as highlighted in that Long Tunman piece, already showed a completely different cognitive framework.
He wasn't just doing a job.
No, he was identifying friction points in people's lives and exploiting them.
The examples are quite revealing. Take the paper route. He didn't just toss the newspaper on the porch and leave. He recognized that during the New York winters, the people receiving the papers also had a secondary, immediate problem. Their driveways were covered in snow.
So he upsells them.
Exactly. He offered a snow shoveling service alongside the delivery. He was already thinking about upselling by identifying an unmet need in a captive audience.
And the Italian Eye story is even more telling. Tell me if I'm analyzing this right. Getting a summer job, usually means standing behind a counter at an ice cream parlor waiting for customers to walk in. He bypasses the parlor entirely.
He goes straight to the consumer.
Right. He buys cheap Italian ices in bulk, packs them in coolers, and walks up and down the local beaches. He targets people who are hot, sunburned, and, most importantly, too lazy to pack up their towels and walk to the boardwalk to buy a drink. I mean, he made $20,000 doing this as a teenager.
Your analysis is spot on, and it highlights a critical component of his psychology. What's fascinating here is how early that specific sales philosophy crystallized. He realized that the greatest profit margins don't come from having the best product, they come from bridging the gap of convenience.
He's monetizing laziness.
Precisely.
Yeah.
He was observing human behaviors, specifically lethargy and immediate gratification, and bringing the solution directly to the problem. He wasn't selling flavored ice, he was selling the convenience of not having to move. And this exact perspective, viewing the consumer not as a person to serve, but as a psychological puzzle to solve and exploit, became the cornerstone of his eventual Wall Street empire.
So he has this inherent understanding of human behavioral economics, but his actual entry into Wall Street was notoriously disastrous. After college and a brief stint running a meat-selling business, which actually went bankrupt because his own employees essentially conned him, which is a highly ironic detail, he decides to become a stockbroker.
He sees a neighbor driving a nice car, right?
Yeah, sees the car and realizes finance is where the liquid capital is. So he gets hired at L.F. Rothschild, a prestigious established firm. He spends 6 grueling months at the bottom of the ladder, cold calling, learning the ropes, getting his broker's license, and then his very first official day as a fully licensed broker arrives.
Yes, his first day operating with full privileges was October 19th, 1987.
For anyone who knows financial history, that date just sends a shiver down the spine. Black Monday.
The worst possible day.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummets a catastrophic 22.6% in a single trading session.
Yeah.
It was absolute pandemonium. L.F. Rothschild takes a massive hit, and he is laid off almost immediately. It's the worst possible timing. But this catastrophic setback is actually the catalyst that pushes him out of the regulated light and into the shadows. Because instead of leaving finance, he pivots to the rural penny stock market. And this is where the mindset divergence really happens, doesn't it?
It is the defining pivot of his career. To understand his mindset, we have to contrast it with the standard professional ethos of the time. A traditional Wall Street broker at a major firm was, theoretically, engaged in fundamental analysis.
Looking at the actual numbers.
Right. They were looking at price-to-earnings ratios, evaluating long-term market trends, assessing a company's leadership team, and advising clients on sustainable growth portfolios. The goal was to build wealth over time by investing in legitimate enterprises.
But the penny stock market was a completely different beast. These are shares of obscure, unregulated, often entirely worthless companies, traded over the counter for literal pennies.
When he looked at the penny stock market, he didn't see financial instruments. He saw a vehicle for pure human psychology and aggressive salesmanship. The standard broker analyzed the company. He analyzed the buyer.
That's a huge distinction.
It changes everything. He realized that the people buying these pink sheet stocks weren't institutional investors or wealthy hedge fund managers. They were working-class people. Plumbers, electricians, post office workers, people who felt locked out of the traditional avenues of wealth.
And the financial incentive for the broker was astronomical. I mean, if you sold a normal blue-chip stock like IBM or General Electric, your commission might be a tiny fraction of a percent. But the Longterman article notes that the commissions on these penny stocks were a staggering 60%.
60% is just unheard of in traditional finance.
Right. If you sold $10,000 of a garbage stock, you kept $6,000 for yourself. That structure naturally selects for predatory behavior.
It absolutely does, and his perspective shifted accordingly. He recognized very quickly that he wasn't selling a share of a legitimate growing company. He was selling the abstract dream of instant wealth to people who were desperate for a shortcut.
He weaponized their hope.
That's exactly it. He took the high-end, aggressive, sophisticated sales tactics he had learned during his training at Rothschild, the tone of voice, the manufactured urgency, the authoritative posturing, and unleashed them on unsophisticated buyers in an unregulated market. It was essentially bringing a machine gun to a knife fight.
This perfectly frames the famous analogy that everyone remembers, which the Longterman article highlights so well. Sell me this pen. It's become a cliche in sales seminars, but analyzing it reveals so much about how he viewed human interaction. If you ask a normal person on the street to sell you a pen, They will almost always focus on the object itself.
They'll list its features.
Yeah, they'll tell you it has blue ink, it writes smoothly, it has a comfortable grip, it's affordable.
That is the feature-based approach, but his mindset completely bypassed the object. For him, the pen was irrelevant. The entire interaction was about the buyer's psychology.
Create the demand.
Exactly. His approach was to hand the pen back, ask the person to write their name on a piece of paper, and wait for them to say, "I don't have a pen," at which point he would reply, "Exactly. Supply and demand."
It's brilliant in a very dark way. He isn't selling the product's quality. He is manufacturing an urgent problem for the customer out of thin air and then immediately offering his product as the only viable solution to the problem he just created.
It is the purest distillation of an empathy void sales mindset. The customer is not a human being with financial needs. The customer is an obstacle holding money, and the goal is to systematically remove their objections until the money is transferred.
Just stripping the humanity out of the transaction entirely.
Completely. This hyper-focused, predatory philosophy was highly effective on an individual level, but it required an infrastructure to scale. That necessity leads us to the year 1989 and the creation of his own firm, Stratton Oakmont.
Let's talk about the founding of Stratton Oakmont, because even the origin story of the partnership has been heavily fictionalized. We all know the cinematic version where he meets Danny Porish in a diner. Porish is mesmerized by the Jaguar parked outside, asks to see a pay stub, and quits his job on the spot.
It's a great movie scene.
Oh, it's fantastic cinema. But the actual historical record, as documented by the New York Post and highlighted in History versus Hollywood, is much more mundane, yet somehow more indicative of how easily his influence spread.
The reality is that they met through their wives on a commuter bus.
A commuter bus.
Right. Danny Porish's first wife, Nancy, shared a regular bus route with his first wife, Denise. They lived in the same apartment building complex. The story goes that he politely gave up his seat for Nancy on the bus. They struck up a conversation, and she later introduced her husband, Danny, who was running a struggling ambulance service at the time.
So it wasn't a diner epiphany. It was a mundane suburban introduction. But the result was the same. One conversation about the money flowing through the penny stock market, and Danny Porish was studying for his broker's exam. Together, they built Stratton Oakmont, which became the ultimate vehicle for institutionalizing that empathy void mindset we were just discussing. They essentially industrialized the process of financial exploitation.
They perfected the pump and dump mechanic. While many listeners might be familiar with the term, the sheer scale and audacity of how Stratton Oakmont executed it is staggering. It required an army of compliant workers.
I want to make sure we are all on the same page about how this mechanical fraud actually functioned. Because it wasn't just a few guys making phone calls. It was a massive, coordinated assault on the retail market. Stratton Oakmont would quietly acquire massive blocks of shares in an incredibly cheap, practically worthless penny stock. Because the stock was so cheap and thinly traded, they essentially controlled the supply.
Once they held the majority of the shares, the pump phase began. They deployed their boiler room, an army of young, aggressive brokers armed with heavily scripted, psychologically manipulative pitches written by the boss himself.
Sticking strictly to the script.
Always. These brokers would call unsuspecting retail investors nationwide, hyping this specific stock with fabricated news, exaggerated earnings projections, and false promises of imminent corporate buyouts.
They created a localized frenzy. They applied that, "Sell me this pen," manufactured urgency to the stock market. You have to buy now or you'll miss the boat.
Right.
And as thousands of these working-class investors poured their savings into the stock, the massive influx of buy orders caused the price of the stock to artificially skyrocket.
Which brings us to the dump. Once the stock price reached an artificial peak, the inner circle would quietly sell off all their secretly held shares at the vastly inflated price. They walked away with tens of millions of dollars in pure liquid profit.
And what happens to the retail investors? Once the brokers stop hyping the stock, the artificial demand vanishes. The stock price plummets back to its actual value, which is usually fractions of a penny. The ordinary investors are left holding completely worthless paper, their life savings entirely wiped out.
The scale of this operation during its peak in the 1990s is difficult to overstate. According to the financial documentation we reviewed, they had over 1,000 brokers crammed into this boiler room in Long Island. They were generating between $50 and $100 million annually.
Unbelievable.
Their monthly overhead just to keep the operation running was $5 million. And they didn't just do this once or twice. They manipulated the initial public offerings, or IPOs, of at least 34 different companies.
The most infamous of which, of course, was the Steve Madden IPO. The New York Times and Slate sources provide the mind-bending numbers on this specific deal. Through a complex arrangement of hidden ownership and aggressive pumping, he personally made approximately $23 million in a window of about 2 hours when that stock went public.
23 million in 2 hours. Let that sink in.
It's just monopoly money at that point. Steve Madden himself, who interestingly was a childhood friend of Denny Porush, was deeply complicit in the arrangement and ultimately served 31 months in federal prison for his role in the manipulation.
To manage an operation of this magnitude, populated by young, highly aggressive individuals handling massive sums of money, requires a very specific approach to management. And this requires us to look at his perspective on leadership, which sharply deviated from conventional corporate governance.
To put it mildly,
A traditional CEO, at least in theory, attempts to foster a culture of corporate responsibility, ethical compliance, and sustainable long-term growth. They want stability.
stability was the enemy at Stratton Oakmont. He didn't want stable employees. He wanted hungry, desperate fanatics.
Precisely. He built a culture of absolute, unrestrained debauchery. And we must understand that this wasn't accidental. The partying wasn't a byproduct of the success. It was a deliberate management strategy.
I think this is a huge point. How does encouraging your employees to engage in rampant drug use and reckless spending actually benefit the company? It seems completely counterintuitive to running a business.
It is a dark form of psychological tethering. If your employees are living lives of extreme excess, if they are encouraged to spend their massive commission checks immediately on luxury cars, enormous mortgages, designer clothes, and illicit substances, they become trapped.
The golden handcuffs.
Exactly. They elevate their lifestyle to a point where they are perpetually indebted and constantly need an infusion of massive amounts of cash just to maintain the baseline.
They're living paycheck to paycheck, but the paychecks are $50,000.
Yes. They can never leave the firm because nowhere else in the world will pay them that kind of money for essentially having no tangible skills other than reading a script over the phone. They become entirely dependent on the firm and, by extension, fanatically loyal to him. They will do absolutely whatever he tells them to do on the phone, no matter how unethical, because they are terrified of losing the lifestyle he introduced them to.
It's an incredibly manipulative ecosystem. And we have to trace the lineage of this philosophy back to Mark Hanna. He was the real-life senior broker at Rothschild who mentored him during those first 6 months, famously played by Matthew McConaughey in the film.
The chest-thumping scene.
Yeah, and according to the Daily Beast, the bizarre chest thumping might be Hollywood flair, but the core advice was shockingly real. Hanna genuinely taught him that the only way to survive the crushing pressure of Wall Street was to adopt a philosophy of, and I'm quoting the source directly here, masturbation, cocaine, and hookers.
He took that deeply cynical survival mechanism from the 1980s corporate culture and weaponized it, making it the foundational corporate mandate of his own firm in the 1990s. The examples of this excess are heavily documented and frankly astonishing.
It was a zoo.
Mother Jones confirms that the culture was so depraved they actually paid a female employee $10,000 to have her head completely shaved bald in the middle of the trading floor while everyone cheered. She reportedly used the money to purchase breast implants.
The atmosphere was a continuous state of mania, fueled by an astonishing volume of narcotics. Quaaludes, cocaine, morphine, Xanax. It was a daily diet for the entire executive team. Though as a quick aside, Watch Mojo points out a rather hilarious historical inaccuracy in the film's opening monologue regarding this.
Oh, the Adderall anachronism.
Right. The cinematic version lists Adderall as a staple of his daily drug diet in the 1980s. However, Adderall wasn't actually released onto the pharmaceutical market until 1996, so that's a small anachronism right there. But the larger point remains, the volume of illicit substances flowing through that office was staggering and entirely real.
The intention behind this culture of indulgence was to cultivate a specific psychological state among the brokers. He wanted them to feel like masters of the universe, apex predators who were entirely untouchable by the mundane rules, laws, and moral constraints that govern normal society.
Now, hearing all these insane numbers and bizarre stories of debauchery, it's completely natural for you to wonder where the line is. Just how much of the chaos we saw on screen is cold, hard fact, and how much is just the magic of Hollywood embellishment?
It is a vital question, and it is the central problem when analyzing this subject. We must always remember that the primary source material for both the film and much of the public narrative is his own memoir. As the Cinema Blend article astutely points out, he is the ultimate unreliable narrator.
He's always selling.
Even when he is sitting down to confess his crimes and detail his downfall, He is still, fundamentally, a salesman. He is selling you a carefully curated version of himself.
That is such a crucial point to keep in mind. He never stops pitching. So let's play a little fact versus fiction and break down the mythology. Let's start with the things that were entirely fake or heavily embellished for dramatic effect. For instance, the chimpanzee.
Right, the roller skating chimp.
There was no chimpanzee roller skating through the office in a diaper. Danny Porush firmly disputes that ever happening.
Porush also heavily disputes the infamous dwarf-tossing event, which serves as a major set piece in the film. While the firm did hire little people to attend a boisterous office party, the actual physical tossing likely never occurred. The memoir only mentions it as a depraved idea they discussed, not an action they executed.
But the most fascinating fabrication to me is the title itself. The very moniker, the Wolf of Wall Street, is a complete invention. Danny Porush has stated on the record, unequivocally, that absolutely no one at the firm and no one on Wall Street ever called him that name during his career.
Not once.
He literally made it up years later while sitting in prison to use as a catchy, marketable title for his book.
This is where we need to apply that psychological lens again. Why invent the Wolf nickname? What does that tell us about his self-perception?
It seems like a desperate attempt at branding, right? Trying to make himself sound intimidating.
It's deeper than just marketing. It allows him to romanticize his predatory nature. Calling yourself a wolf frames you as a lone, powerful, natural force. An apex predator operating by the harsh laws of the wild. It sounds far more glamorous, masculine, and sophisticated than the reality of the situation.
Which is what?
The reality is that he wasn't a lone wolf navigating the complex wilderness of global finance. He was a common, organized fraudster running a highly regimented, repetitive scam against vulnerable, unsophisticated retail investors.
There's nothing wild or noble about calling working-class people to steal their saving.
Exactly. Wolf implies a battle of equals in nature. There was no battle here. It was pure exploitation. But admitting you are a con man doesn't sell memoirs or movie rights quite as effectively.
That makes perfect sense. He is controlling the narrative to ensure he is the anti-hero rather than just the villain.
Yeah.
What else was changed? Well, to protect identities and avoid further litigation, several names were altered. Danny Porush became Donnie Azoff. His first wife, Denise, became Teresa, and his second wife, Nadine, became Naomi. But then we transitioned from the fabrications to the stuff that was horrifyingly real, because sometimes the reality was stranger and much darker than fiction.
Indeed. The cast of characters surrounding him was largely authentic. The Quaalude supplier, depicted in the film Brad Bodnick, played with intense nervous energy by John Bernthal, is based on a real person named Todd Garrett. He has claimed that Garrett sold him roughly 10,000 pills over the course of their association.
And the goldfish scene. The moment where the character swallows a live goldfish out of an employee's bowl just to assert dominance.
Entirely factual. Mother Jones confirms that Danny Porush really did swallow an employee's live goldfish. And the reasoning is just as petty as depicted. He did it simply to punish the man for wearing a bow tie, an article of clothing Porush apparently despised, and for having the audacity to clean his fishbowl during market hours.
Just absolute workplace terror.
Furthermore, yes, the bizarre personal detail that Danny Porush married his own first cousin, Nancy, is also a matter of public record.
But as we sift through these anecdotes, we have to acknowledge a stark tonal shift between the movie's portrayal and the historical reality. In the film, a lot of the severe drug use is played for comedic effect. It's slapstick. But the reality of their addiction lacked that cinematic sheen.
It was profoundly dark and deeply destructive.
I want to focus on the country club scene. In the movie, it's a hilarious sequence. He takes a massive dose of expired Quaaludes, loses motor function, and has to crawl to his Lamborghini to get home. He thinks he drove perfectly, but the next morning, the police show up and the car is destroyed. It's played for laughs. But the true story, as noted by the Daily Beast in his own memoir, is terrifying.
It wasn't a Lamborghini either, right?
First of all, it was a Mercedes, not a Lamborghini.
Yeah.
But the make of the car is irrelevant compared to what actually happened.
He was so heavily intoxicated on expired sedatives that he experienced a complete blackout. He had zero memory of his drive home. But the physical evidence in police reports showed that he caused multiple severe accidents along his route. This included a head-on collision that was severe enough to send a woman to the hospital with significant injuries.
And it gets worse. He didn't just crash on the highway. As he details in his own writings, he managed to get the car to his estate, but then crashed it violently through his own garage door, ultimately smashing into a solid limestone pillar. And sitting in a front passenger seat during this entire catastrophic drug-fueled demolition derby was his unbuckled 3-year-old daughter.
That is just, it's chilling.
When you stop laughing at the movie and look at that fact, an unbuckled toddler in a violently crashing car driven by a man completely out of his mind on sedatives, it entirely strips away the glamour. It's not a funny anecdote about Wall Street excess. It's a miracle a child didn't die.
That specific detail is arguably the most important piece of information for understanding his mindset during this era. It highlights the deeply pathological nature of his addiction and his complete, terrifying disregard for the safety of others.
The empathy void.
The empathy void mindset we discussed regarding his clients had fully metastasized into his personal life. His sense of invincibility off the trading floor was absolute. He genuinely believed that the consequences of his actions, no matter how reckless, simply would not apply to him.
And that feeling of invincibility, that belief that he was insulated from consequence, naturally extended to every environment he entered, including the sea. Which leads us to one of the most cinematic, dramatic, and entirely real moments of his life, the sinking of the superyacht.
This is an event documented extensively by multiple sources, including Acting Magazine and his own detailed accounts. It is a masterclass in hubris. He owned a 167-foot luxury superyacht.
And we have to emphasize, this wasn't just any yacht. This floating palace had an incredible pedigree. It originally belonged to the legendary fashion icon Coco Chanel. It was a piece of maritime history. He bought it, retrofitted it with every conceivable luxury, and renamed it the Nadine after his second wife.
In the summer of 1997, the yacht was sailing in the Mediterranean Sea, off the coast of Sardinia. The meteorological conditions began to deteriorate rapidly. A severe, massive storm was brewing.
A real monster of a storm.
The yacht's captain, a seasoned professional mariner with extensive maritime experience and deep knowledge of those specific waters, analyzed the incoming weather and repeatedly warned his employer that sailing in those conditions was incredibly dangerous. He explicitly advised staying in port, essentially stating that taking the ship out would be suicidal.
But we are dealing with a man who does not take no for an answer from anyone. He is openly admitted to being heavily intoxicated on a cocktail of drugs during this specific incident. He completely ignored the expert advice of the man hired to keep him alive. He demanded they stick to his schedule and sail to Monaco. He essentially ordered the captain to steer a 167-foot luxury vessel directly into a massive storm system.
I want to pause here and analyze this decision because it serves as the ultimate, perfectly distilled metaphor for his entire psychological makeup. Why does a stockbroker override a ship captain regarding weather?
Because he thinks he's a god.
Because his worldview had been entirely corrupted by his financial success. He truly believed that his immense wealth, his sheer willpower, and his inflated ego could literally overrule the natural forces of the planet. He wrote about this moment in his memoir, and the quote is incredibly telling. He wrote, "I thought nothing could stop me, not the government, not the market, not even the sea."
It is the definition of a god complex. But the sea doesn't care about your bank account. The result was absolutely catastrophic. The rough seas and massive waves violently overburdened the yacht's mechanical systems. The ship suffered critical mechanical failures, losing power and steering in the middle of a raging storm. The waves began to engulf the Nadine. They were forced to broadcast a mayday and call the Italian Coast Guard and Navy for an emergency rescue.
And even the rescue operation highlights the absurdity of his lifestyle. In the movie adaptation, a rescue helicopter tragically crashes onto the deck of the sinking yacht due to the storm. The reality was different, but arguably just as cinematic.
They pushed the helicopter.
They actually had to physically muscle his personal private helicopter off the top deck and push it into the raging ocean. They didn't do this by accident. They had to clear the helipad just to make enough room for the military rescue chopper to lower a commando down to hoist the passengers and crew to safety.
Imagine pushing a multi-million-dollar helicopter into the ocean just so you can be saved from a disaster you explicitly caused by ignoring advice. The yacht, this beautiful historical symbol of extreme wealth, eventually succumbed to the damage and now sits permanently at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. It is a literal sunken monument to sheer, unadulterated hubris.
And while it is miraculous that everyone on board survived the ordeal, we cannot just marvel at the spectacle. We have to consider the collateral human damage of his ego, the people forced to endure his god complex. And this brings us to the perspective of the woman the yacht was named after, Nadine Caridi.
The All That's Interesting source provides a very sobering, necessary counter-narrative by looking at her life with him. When they met, she was a 22-year-old model. She was swept up in this whirlwind of immense wealth. The press dubbed her the Duchess of Bay Ridge. They had lavish Caribbean weddings. She had a super yacht named after her. They lived in massive estates. To the outside observer, it looked like a fairy tale.
But behind the closed doors of those estates, the reality was incredibly dark and harrowing. In her subsequent accounts, she describes a marriage marked by severe emotional manipulation, extreme volatility, and domestic violence.
We mentioned his need for absolute control earlier, regarding his brokers and the ship's captain. That need for control bled directly into his home life.
Precisely. She noted that her autonomy, her agency, and her individuality were systematically squashed while married to him. He was relentlessly controlling of her movements and her behavior. The environment was toxic, fueled by his massive drug intake, and it escalated to physical violence.
It's just horrific.
In one deeply disturbing instance she has publicly recounted, she claims he physically kicked her down a flight of stairs during an altercation while he was holding their young daughter.
It's horrifying. She eventually tried to hold an intervention to address his rampant drug use, telling him flat out that she wouldn't stick around just to watch him kill himself while making everyone else around him rich. But the damage to the relationship was irreparable. They eventually divorced. However, I think it is vital we discuss her post-divorce pivot, because it is incredibly inspiring and offers a stark contrast to the story of the man she left.
It is a remarkable trajectory. She didn't just fade into the background, she used intensive therapy to process and escape the trauma of that environment. She went back into academia, earned her advanced degrees, and became Dr. Nadine Macaluso.
She is now a licensed clinical psychologist. And what is her specialty?
She specializes in helping women recognize and heal from trauma bonding and emotional manipulation in abusive narcissistic relationships.
She took her firsthand experience with his manipulative, empathy-void mindset and built a career focused entirely on healing and empowering others who have suffered similar emotional abuse. It's a powerful reclamation of her narrative.
It is the absolute antithesis of his destructive path. He used his understanding of psychology to exploit and ruin people for financial gain. She uses her understanding of psychology to repair the damage caused by individuals like him.
It's a profound contrast. So the sea couldn't stop him, but eventually the facade had to crack. How did the law finally catch up with a man who had insulated himself with millions of dollars and genuinely thought he could buy his way out of any consequence?
It was not a swift cinematic takedown. It was a long, arduous, highly meticulous process led by the FBI, specifically driven by Special Agent Gregory Coleman. According to the insights from Smart Search, Coleman painstakingly tracked the complex financial movements of Stratton Oakmont for a decade. 10 years of sifting through shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent IPO filings.
And how did our subject react when he realized the FBI was looking into him? Did he panic? Did he try to cover his tracks? True to form, his first instinct was arrogance. He genuinely thought everyone had a price. He actually attempted to bribe Agent Coleman to make the entire federal investigation go away.
Which is a fundamental misunderstanding of federal law enforcement.
Exactly. And when the bribe didn't work, he resorted to petty insults. He arrogantly nicknamed the agent Special Agent OCD Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder because he couldn't comprehend why this guy wouldn't just take the money and stop relentlessly pursuing the paperwork.
But despite Coleman's relentless focus on the boiler room itself, the actual domino that triggered the downfall didn't fall in Long Island. It started overseas.
It's always the money laundering, isn't it?
Usually, yes. The FBI arrested a specific Swiss banker on entirely unrelated charges while the banker was visiting the United States. This was a stroke of immense investigative luck because this particular banker happened to be the key architect aiding him in laundering his millions into secret accounts in Switzerland.
The linchpin.
He was the central hub of the international money movement. Once the FBI had the banker in custody and began applying pressure, that arrest became the loose thread that unraveled the entire financial sweater.
The infrastructure collapsed. In 1998, the authorities finally move in. He is officially arrested and heavily indicted by the federal government for widespread securities fraud and massive money laundering. The charges are severe. He is looking down the barrel of up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Now, let's pause and look at this moment through the lens of his mindset. For years, he preached absolute loyalty. He told his brokers they were a family, an unbreakable phalanx against the regulators. All that bluster, all that demanding of loyalty. How does he react when the steel doors are actually about to close on him?
He flips almost immediately. The illusion of the Stratton Oakmont family evaporated the second his own freedom was threatened. He agreed to cooperate fully with the government. He wore a concealed wire for the FBI to gather incriminating audio on his associates. He systematically snitched on 29 of his closest friends, business partners, and loyal subordinates in order to secure a drastically reduced sentence for himself.
I just want to emphasize that. The man who demanded undying loyalty wore a wire. He even turned in his founding partner, the man he built the empire with, Denny Porish.
And the irony of that betrayal is profound. Because he was the one at the top making the sweeping deals with the federal prosecutors, Danny Porish actually ended up serving 39 months in federal prison, which was significantly longer than the time the mastermind himself served.
If we connect this back to the core theme of our deep dive, his psychological framework, what does that immediate sweeping betrayal tell us?
It proves, definitively, that his highly touted concept of loyalty was entirely transactional. His entire corporate culture, all the speeches and the camaraderie, was built purely on mutual greed. So it is entirely consistent that when faced with a catastrophic loss of freedom, his ultimate mindset defaulted to pure self-preservation. In his worldview, everyone and everything was ultimately expendable if it meant saving himself.
So he cuts his deal, he burns his empire down to save his own skin, and he goes to prison. But even his prison experience sounds bizarrely comfortable. He ends up at Taft Correctional Institution in California. Prisonpedia provides some interesting details on this facility. It was a minimum security camp. We are not talking about a hard time behind iron bars with violent offenders. We're talking about tennis courts and relatively open movement. And his bunkmate.
In an incredibly strange twist of fate, his bunkmate was Tommy Chong, half of the legendary comedy duo Cheech and Chong. Chong was serving a 9-month sentence related to the financing and selling of glass bongs.
You can't write this stuff. So how does a former master of the universe handle being an inmate? Does he show humility? Does he reflect on his actions?
According to Chong's subsequent accounts, his entitled mindset persisted completely unabated. He treated the federal correctional facility essentially like a low-rent hotel. He immediately tried to replicate his lost status by utilizing his remaining financial resources to hire other inmates to perform his basic daily chores.
Oh, we have to talk about the supper club story. This perfectly illustrates his inability to read a room that he can't financially control. So he, Tommy Chong, and a few other relatively affluent inmates form this elite little gang. They pool their commissary resources and eat their meals together, very much mimicking the prison cooking scenes from the movie Goodfellas. So far, so good. But then his hubris kicks in.
Yes. He actually hired another inmate to make his bed every morning, and then he attempted to hire that same inmate to wash all the dirty pots and pans generated by their exclusive supper club.
But the other inmates in the club were absolutely not having it. This isn't Wall Street. You can't just pay someone to do your dirty work to elevate your status. Chong recounted that he got officially kicked out of his own prison supper club after exactly 1 day because his entitled aristocratic behavior was so grating to the other men.
However, despite the friction, Tommy Chong did have a profoundly significant impact on his future trajectory. They would stay up late at night in their cubicle, and he would regale Chong with these wild, unfiltered, exaggerated stories about his Wall Street days, the drugs, the parties, the madness. Chong, being an entertainer, found the story highly compelling and strongly encouraged him to write them down and publish a book.
He struggled with the actual mechanics of writing at first. But then, browsing the prison library, he picked up Tom Wolfe's seminal novel about 1980s excess, The Bonfire of the Vanities. He was captivated by the stylistic, frenetic, highly cynical prose. He decided that was exactly the voice and structure he wanted to use to tell his own story. That literary discovery in a prison library is the genesis of his best-selling memoir and eventually the blockbuster film.
But his relatively brief and comfortable time in prison brings up a highly contentious, profoundly serious issue regarding the American justice system. And this requires us to shift from the biographical to the systemic. We have to look at the numbers. He orchestrated a massive, highly complex fraud that devastated over 1,500 individual investors. The total quantified financial damage was approximately $200 million.
$200 million stolen from working-class people.
For orchestrating this catastrophic financial ruin, he served only 22 months of a 4-year sentence.
22 months. It's almost incomprehensible. If someone robs a convenience store for $500 with a weapon, they could easily face 10 years. He seals $200 million with a telephone and serves less than 2 years. How is that functionally possible within the legal system?
That is precisely the question addressed in the fascinating academic piece from the Wayne Law Review. This article provides vital historical and legal context on the massive discrepancy in white-collar sentencing. To understand his sentence, we have to understand the era in which he operated and compare it to both what preceded him and the severe crackdowns that followed.
Break down the Wayne Law Review analysis for us. How does the timeline work?
The piece notes that during the 1980s, the era when he first entered finance sentences for massive financial crimes, were surprisingly lenient, particularly for individuals who agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. The legal culture viewed these crimes as complex regulatory violations rather than acts of violence. For example, Ivan Bajeski, a notorious arbitrager heavily involved in insider trading who profited by over $80 million, was sentenced to 3 years and served exactly 22 months.
The exact same amount of time.
Yes. Another key figure, Michael Milken, famously known as the junk bond king, originally received a harsh 10-year sentence. But after agreeing to cooperate extensively, his sentence was significantly reduced, and he too served just 22 months.
So there was a deeply established precedent. When he was finally sentenced in 2003, after cooperating and wearing the wire, the judge handing down the 22-month stint was essentially acting in line with the historical established norms of rewarding white-collar cooperation.
Exactly. The system prized the dismantling of the networks over the harsh punishment of the individual. However, the Wayne Law Review points out a chilling reality for him. If he had committed these exact same crimes just a decade later, the legal landscape would have resulted in a drastically different outcome.
What changed?
Public perception and legislative reform. Following massive corporate scandals like Enron and WorldCom and later the 2008 financial crisis, the public and the courts grew incredibly weary of a justice system that seemed to offer mere slaps on the wrist to wealthy executives who destroyed thousands of lives. The federal sentencing guidelines were overhauled to reflect the severe human cost of financial fraud. The article cites the case of James Nicholson, who in 2010 defrauded investors of $141 million.
Which is significantly less than the $200 million our subject stole.
Correct. But because Nicholson was sentenced under the new paradigm, he didn't get a few years in a camp. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison.
40 years. That is a staggering difference. How would the math have worked out for our subject under those new rules?
Yeah. The Wayne Law Review provides the specific legal calculus. Under the updated 2013 federal sentencing guidelines, the severity of a crime is assigned a numerical offense level. Due to the massive dollar amount of the loss and the high number of individual victims, his offense level would have jumped dramatically from a level 28 up to a level 47.
And what does a level 47 actually mean in practical terms?
To put that in perspective, a level 47 is essentially the absolute highest severity bracket the federal system possesses. It is reserved for the most catastrophic, treasonous, or Enron-level offenses. Under a level 28, his advisory sentence range was roughly 78 to 97 months. Under a level 47, the federal guidelines advise a sentence of life in prison.
Life in prison for penny stock fraud.
Yes. Now, legally, it would have been capped at the statutory maximum for the specific charges, which was 20 years. But the point the analysis makes is profound. Instead of being out in under 2 years to write a book, he would have likely served the absolute maximum of 2 decades behind bars.
The Wayne Law Review really forces you to confront the fundamental fairness of our justice system. The question hangs in the air. Did his cooperation wearing a wire to record his friends truly justify such an incredibly lenient sentence compared to modern standards? The inconsistency reveals a legal system that was, for a long time, deeply struggling to accurately quantify the actual human devastation caused by financial crimes.
And we must emphasize that human devastation. These were not victimless crimes against faceless hedge funds or massive institutional banks that could absorb the loss. The money came from real people.
This is where we have to look at the victims, because their voices are often drowned out by the noise of the movie. Prisonpedia highlights the story of victims like Tom Pokorny. Pokorny was an ordinary guy who got caught up in the high-pressure sales tactics. He ultimately lost $800,000 to Stratton Oakmont. It completely wiped him out. He stated that the extreme, relentless financial stress caused by that loss directly cost him his marriage and fractured his family. He's been very vocal in the media, stating that the glamorous Hollywood treatment of the story sends the wrong message to would-be scammers. It makes the crime look fun and the punishment look trivial.
Which leads us perfectly into the reality of his second act. Because while his prison sentence concluded over 2 decades ago, the financial damage he inflicted upon people like Tom Pokorny is far from resolved. The ledger is not balanced.
So, what does this all mean for him today? Let's look at the cold, hard numbers regarding his restitution. As part of his incredibly lenient sentencing agreement, he was legally ordered to pay $110.4 million in restitution to a victim's compensation fund. Decades have passed since that order. How much does he still owe today?
The current estimates indicate he still owes roughly $97 to $100 million of that original $110 million.
Wait, hold on. I need to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. Decades later, and he still owes nearly $100 million. How much has actually been paid back?
Approximately $12.8 million has been deposited into the victims fund. However, we must look at where that money came from. Of that $12.8 million, a staggering $11 million came directly from the liquidation of physical assets like real estate, vehicles, and the remnants of his brokerage accounts that the government forcibly seized at the time of his initial arrest.
So he didn't actively pay that $11 million, the government took it.
Precisely. His actual voluntary payments out of his post-prison earnings have been incredibly minimal in comparison to his debt.
And it's not like he is struggling to find work. He completely reinvented himself. He transitioned from a convicted fraudster to a highly sought-after master sales trainer and corporate motivational speaker. He runs a company called Global Motivation, Inc. Financial estimates suggest he brings in roughly $18 million a year. He charges anywhere from $30,000 to $75,000 for a standard speaking engagement. If you want him for a premium gig or a private corporate retreat, his fee can reach up to $200,000 for a single appearance. He has multiple streams of income: book royalties from the memoir, international movie rights, highly priced online sales courses.
He has even aggressively entered the modern digital finance space, running high-end cryptocurrency seminars. In 2022, he hosted a private, exclusive crypto workshop at his massive estate in Miami. 9 attendees paid roughly $40,000 each, which was equivalent to 1 Bitcoin at the time, just for the privilege of spending a weekend listening to him speak about digital assets.
So he is pulling in $18 million a year, hosting crypto seminars at a Miami estate. How much is he actually required to pay his victims every month?
Due to complex, heavily litigated negotiations regarding his restitution agreement, he currently only pays between $4,000 and $10,000 a month toward the victims fund.
$4,000 to $10,000 a month, while making $18 million a year. This brings up a completely mind-blowing calculation from the Thai financial blog Long Tunman. They look at the discrepancy between his income, his massive debt, and his tiny monthly payments. They crunch the numbers. If he continues paying the minimum required amount of roughly $4,000 a month, how long will it take him to pay off the $100 million he owes?
According to their mathematical projection, at that rate, it will take him over 1,600 years to pay his victims back.
1,600 years. The Roman Empire fell less time ago than that. It essentially guarantees mathematically and legally that the vast majority of his victims will die long before they are ever made whole. Meanwhile, the man who stole their money continues to live a life of absolute luxury, completely insulated from the financial ruin he caused.
And this incredible disparity, this ability to profit immensely while entirely avoiding the moral weight of his past, is why we have to analyze that Reddit thread we found in our research. The thread meticulously dissects the very final scene of Scorsese's film. It is a brilliant, highly cynical piece of filmmaking that says absolutely everything about his current status and his enduring mindset.
Set the scene for us. It's the end of the 3-hour movie. Where are we?
The scene takes place at a brightly lit motivational sales seminar in Auckland, New Zealand. A booming voice is introducing Leonardo DiCaprio's character to the stage, hyping him up as the greatest sales trainer in the world. And who is the MC holding the microphone and delivering this introduction?
It is the real-life man himself.
Yes. The real convicted fraudster is standing on screen, introducing the glamorous Hollywood actor who just spent 3 hours depicting his heinous crimes.
It's an incredibly meta, almost surreal moment. DiCaprio takes the microphone, looking exhausted but focused. He walks down the steps off the stage and directly into the audience. He walks up to a random person in the front row, hands them a pen, and issues the famous command. "Sell me this pen." The person fumbles, confused. DiCaprio snatches it back, moves to the next person. "Sell me this pen." They stumble over their words, and as he continues this exercise, the camera slowly zooms out, panning over the faces of the massive audience.
What the Reddit analysis points out so astutely is the specific look on the faces of that crowd as the camera lingers on them. They are not looking at him with judgment or condemnation for his past. They are looking at him with absolute, unadulterated desperation. They are mesmerized. They are hanging on his every single movement, desperately hoping that he will impart some magical secret formula that will allow them to become instantly wealthy.
The chilling reality that the film leaves us with, and that the Reddit thread highlights, is that his core mindset, hasn't changed a single bit since the days of the boiler room. He is still operating on the exact same psychological frequency. He is still leveraging people's inherent desperation, their lethargy, and their deep-seated greed. He is still finding an audience that wants a shortcut to wealth and exploiting that desire.
The only difference is the product he is pushing. He isn't illegally selling them manipulated, worthless penny stocks anymore over a telephone. He is legally selling them the idea of himself from a stage. He is selling them his straight-line system sales methodology. He is selling them access to his proximity. But the core transaction relies on the exact same psychological vulnerability. The belief that he holds the secret to easy money, and if you just pay his fee, he will give it to you.
It really makes you stop and reflect on our own cultural values, doesn't it? His undeniable charisma, his absolute refusal to feel shame, allowed him to pivot seamlessly from a convicted, disgraced felon to a celebrated pop culture icon and a highly paid corporate guru. We literally buy tickets to hear him speak. Corporations hire him to motivate their sales teams. We watch movies that glorify his excess.
It is an absolute masterclass in narrative control. He took a dark, depressing story of financial exploitation and human ruin and successfully repackaged it as an edgy, aspirational tale of rock and roll excess. The precise mindset that allowed him to ruthlessly manipulate the financial market is the exact same mindset that allowed him to successfully manipulate his own public redemption arc. He sold us the pen.
To summarize what we've unpacked today for you listening, this story is vastly more significant than a wild, entertaining tale of 1990s Wall Street excess, dwarf-tossing rumors, and sunken super yachts. It is a profound, deeply uncomfortable study of how a specific, ruthless, empathy-void mindset can weaponize human psychology and greed on a massive industrial scale. He didn't invent greed, but he built a perfectly tuned, highly efficient machine to exploit it. This raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. Why do we, as a society, continue to financially reward and actively idolize individuals who have caused quantifiable, devastating ruin to ordinary people? What does it say about our collective priorities and our moral compass that a convicted fraudster remains a highly sought-after voice on success and wealth building? Why are we so willing to separate the man's crimes from the man's advice? That is a heavy, necessary question.
And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. If his ultimate most profitable product was never actually penny stocks, but rather the intoxicating, highly marketable illusion of overnight success, we have to look critically at our modern landscape. Look at the rise of the unregulated gig economy. Look at the volatile fringes of crypto culture. Look at the endless sea of hustle influencers on social media selling expensive courses on how to get rich quick with zero effort. We have to ask ourselves, is this modern digital ecosystem just a decentralized, digitized version of his Long Island boiler room? Are we all still just sitting in a massive virtual audience, desperate, mesmerized, and waiting for someone to sell us a pen?
Wow, that is definitely something to think about the next time you see a sponsored ad for a masterclass guaranteeing financial freedom.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you a completely new perspective on a story you thought you already knew. Stay curious, keep digging deeper, and always, always keep questioning the narratives you're being sold. We'll catch you on the next one.